Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, there seems to be a difference of opinion about whether we should have an accountability system that treats for-profit colleges differently from other colleges and universities. So I just want to jump straight into that discussion. Mr. Miller, which colleges are driven by the personal financial interests of private investors rather than accountability to state taxpayers or volunteer boards of trustees?
For-profit colleges, Senator Warren.
For-profit colleges. And which colleges have to demonstrate quarterly profit growth to please Wall Street shareholders?
Those are the publicly traded for-profit colleges.
And which colleges usually spend far more money on marketing and advertising than they spend on actually teaching anything?
Those are also in the for-profit sector.
And which colleges enroll less than 10% of all students, but are responsible for nearly 30% of all student loan defaults?
That's the for-profit college sector.
And which colleges are more often investigated or sued by state and federal authorities for defrauding students?
Those are also for-profit colleges.
And which colleges are the only schools that force their students to sign away their legal rights through arbitration agreements?
Those are also, we've only seen the for-profit sector.
And which colleges are responsible for 98.6% of all fraud claims from defrauded students?
For-profit colleges as well.
So, two of the largest college collapses in the history of American higher education occurred recently when Corinthian and ITT imploded, ruining the lives of hundreds of thousands of students. What kinds of schools were those?
They were for-profit colleges, Senator Warren.
Mr. Miller, are for-profit colleges different? And should the federal government have rules that acknowledge that difference?
I believe they are, Senator Warren. I mean, I believe we've seen that we have a financial aid system now that allows for profit without showing high-quality student outcomes as well, and that the business model in the wrong hands becomes too much about recruitment and not quality.
Well, thank you. You know, investors in for-profit colleges often focus on boosting their profits by squeezing every possible dime out of students and out of taxpayers by any means necessary, even if it sometimes means breaking the law. For-profit colleges are different. And when the federal government pours billions of dollars into these colleges, we should put some restrictions on the money that recognize those differences. History shows us that for-profit colleges need heightened accountability, but I think there is a much larger problem here, and that is all colleges pretty much get access to federal dollars no matter the quality of the education that they provide, and no matter how high tuition rises, and no matter how hard it is for students to repay their loans. We have built a system where everyone but the wealthiest students need a federal grant or a federal loan in order to afford college. And then the federal government and the accreditors put their rubber stamp of approval on these schools, and students reasonably conclude that those schools will pay off for them because we have vouched for them. Mr. Delisle, I know you're concerned about accountability for the taxpayer, but isn't the best way to protect the interests of the taxpayer to stop rubber stamping bad schools and funneling federal dollars into them in the first place so that students can get cheated by them?
Well, I mean, I think you're right in terms of, you know, some of the gatekeeping role that accreditors have played and state authorization. I mean, clearly hasn't prevented a lot of problems and a lot of bad outcomes. Okay. And so I think that, but I also think that if you have a sort of student outcome in mind that you think is acceptable and a student outcome in mind that you think is bad and unacceptable, I think that standard can apply to institutions regardless of how much money they're getting and regardless of their tax status or whether or not they have private investors.
Oh, well, you know, I'd be fine with that if the schools were the same. But I think as the list of questions I went through with Mr. Miller's show, we know where the principal problem is, and we need to focus on that principal problem. It's hurting a lot of students. You know, I think that this is, part of what we're talking about here is about incentives. And I think that most schools are acting rationally within the terrible system of incentives that we've set up. Now, I believe that we should have some risk sharing and some accreditation reform legislation to realign our incentives. We have made terrible choices in this country to rely on student debt as the way that most students have access to higher education. And it has really thrown our thinking about accountability out of whack. Instead of asking whether or not students are leaving college ready to focus on successful lives that aren't dominated by monthly debt, we focused almost exclusively in terms of accountability on whether students literally can pay the bare minimum to repay their debts to the federal government. I don't see how we can reauthorize this law without fixing both the college accountability problem and the structural student loan debt problem that's behind this entire business. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.